Madam President, thank you so much for the invitation, the opportunity to address all of you today on the human rights conditions of the Palestinian people living under Israeli occupation. From recorded votes at the United Nations General Assembly, I know most of your governments recognize the magnitude and urgency of this concern, but many feel they lack the capacity to end the injustices of the occupation. Meanwhile, those who have the capacity to defend Palestinian rights either make do with statements of concern or take steps that actually enable the nightmare to continue. Almost 5 decades ago, I was invited to address a UN forum on this very issue. I cited concerns with collective punishment of civilian populations, massive home demolitions, prolonged detention without charge, torture, land confiscation, and settlement expansion. Instead of presenting numbers, I chose to put a human face on the victims. I did so because while Israeli victims of violence were known, Palestinians were objectified and depersonalized. It didn't do justice to simply tally up the numbers of the men in a village whose hands were tied behind their backs, blindfolded, forced to sit in a village square overnight on cold ground or in direct sun in the heat of day. They needed to be known, and the impact of this humiliation and abuse on their families had to be understood. And what of the thousands of families given an hour to clear out their belongings before the bulldozers came to demolish their homes to create a so-called security corridor? Or those awakened in the middle of the night as their homes were invaded, ransacked, and photographed by occupation forces in order to map the neighborhood? Or the farmers standing powerless as their 100-year-old orchards were demolished to make way for a security zone? Behind each incident are real people whose lives were upended, futures darkened, their families traumatized and angry. Tragically, these same horrors continue to define the Palestinian reality today. Annually, the General Assembly speaks to these violations of rights. Its resolutions are ignored. Commissions you create and human rights monitors you empower are denounced and demonized. And when Palestinians prepare a case for the International Criminal Court, they're threatened with sanctions. And yet it remains important to note that these violations continue to occur daily, impacting the lives and futures of millions of real people. Their voices must be heard, their rights must be protected. There are those in my country who denounce the UN for its resolutions on Palestinian rights. They charge the UN with singling Israel out for criticism and suggest an unhealthy obsession with Israel. Such a charge is both false and a denial of Palestinian humanity. In the first place, the UN has a special responsibility for Israel-Palestine. Israel is the only country conditionally admitted for membership, obligating it to implement UN resolutions passed prior to its admission. Since then, and especially after the '67 war, Israel has violated a range of laws and conventions and done so with impunity. It's not Israel that's being singled out for criticism. Rather, it's Israel that's being singled out by some in my country and excused from accountability for their behavior. The deformities this has created are worrisome. There's an extremist political culture in Israel today that's a byproduct of this entitlement and impunity. Polling data demonstrates a majority of Israelis do not view Palestinians as equal human beings, deserving of having their rights protected, with a substantial plurality supporting annexation of occupied lands and the expulsion of Palestinians who live there. At the same time, consider the impact this has had on the Palestinian people and their political culture. Think of the Palestinians forced to wait for hours at a checkpoint to get to a job, to return home, to return to visit a family friend in a nearby village, knowing that at the end of the wait, they can be humiliated by a 19-year-old heavily armed soldier, or the child who's witnessed his father being treated in this manner, and the fear of families of the little children or the adult detainees. Given this traumatic nightmare visited upon millions of Palestinians for the past 56 years, is it any wonder that a recent poll shows a majority of Palestinians rejecting moderate leadership, despairing of peaceful change, and now favoring armed struggle? This tragic deformity in Palestinian political culture is the result of the continued brutality of the occupation. It's also important to see the impact of the harshness the occupation is having in the Arab world. While polls we conducted 4 years ago found a large majority in most Arab countries favoring exploring peace with Israel, saying that it might temper Israel's behavior and stop the violence. More recent polling suggests the hope has decidedly diminished. If our goal is to reignite the prospects for peace, then our focus must be to stay the hand of the occupier, defend the victims of brutality. Right now, concrete action is required to help free the imprisoned children, the detainees, those living under the threat of demolition, land seizure, and settlement expansion. Palestinian rights must be defended because Palestinians are not children of a lesser God. Their lives and futures are as important as those of any other people on earth. There are actions that can be taken that make a difference. You can collectively challenge Security Council vetoes, or as individual member states, your governments can take concrete gestures to support the Palestinian right to seek judgment from the ICC. Or you can implement specific measures holding Israel accountable for its human rights violations. Israel needs to know there are red lines which, if crossed, have consequences. And Palestinians need to know they are not alone, and violence is not the answer. Actions, not statements, will contribute to restoring Palestinian hope, ending Israel's sense of impunity, and empowering those Palestinians and Israelis who seek a peaceful future. Only after we've changed the political dynamic and helped transform the political deformities infecting both societies can a political horizon emerge and meaningful negotiations take place. Thank you.